In this series of videos, we'll look at the period roughly from the end of Jackson's presidency in 1836 through about 1850. And this was really a transformative period in American history. You got the Industrial Revolution continuing to pick up steam, pun intended. People were reacting to the Industrial Revolution in a number of ways. The nation was growing westward towards the Pacific. And of course, the second political party system of Whigs and Democrats was sort of dealing with it all. So that's what we're going to talk about in this series of videos. And in this first one, we'll just start looking at the Industrial Revolution, some of the inventions that were changing life. First, I should note that in the early 1830s, 1831, a French nobleman named Alexis de Tocqueville and his companion had gone all over the United States and sort of recorded what they saw. And the America that they recognized was rapidly changing and rapidly going away. When he got back to Europe, he published Democracy in America. And, he noticed some of the problems in America, but basically it was pretty laudatory. He talked about the equality of Americans, and he noticed that all the land ownership and everything. Well, the Industrial Revolution is going to rapidly change the America that de Tocqueville saw. And so if you read Democracy in America, it's a great description of America in the early 1830s, but by the late 1830s and certainly by the end of the Antebellum period, it's a much different America. In fact, one of the most important inventions that would transform America was happening right about the time de Tocqueville was cruising around America. There of course had been people applying steam power to machines and to boats. Think of Robert Fulton. I'd mentioned all this earlier. And people have, not surprisingly, begun to experiment with applying steam power to carriages and land transportation. And the first person to successfully apply steam power was a New Yorker just after the War of 1812 in the Era of Good Feelings. He put wheels on a large steam engine and let it pull a huge weight on a carriage, all mounted on tracks. And he realized that the tracks were sort of reduced friction. But the steam locomotive was so large and inefficient, and the need to build tracks so laborious and expensive, that commercial railroads were not yet profitable. By the 1830s, however, what you're going to begin to see is the invention of a sort of a rail of iron on a bed of gravel with railroad spikes. It made the production a lot more cost efficient and the ride a lot more smoother. And so it's going to make commercial railroads more profitable. The first successful railroad venture in America was the New York industrialist Peter Cooper, shown here, and his small locomotive known as Tom Thumb. And he was doing this right about the time, right before de Tocqueville came. So we're talking late 1820s. Cooper, by the way, he became famous, and his Tom Thumb was a sort of an attraction in P.T. Barnum's traveling circus. It didn't make a whole lot of money, but as prices keep getting cheaper and cheaper to build and run, railroads began to spread more and more. By the mid-late 1830s, you're going to see several railroad companies beginning to appear, and most of them were local operations, sort of connecting one town to another, often connecting to canals for further and easier transportation. They were owned separately, and they had different type of locomotives and different gauges of the railroad tracks. Railroads were quickly advancing, and by the end of the Antebellum age, it was absolutely amazing how far they'd come. Railroads were, they're more important because they not only speed up travel for commerce, but they carry goods further and faster and cheaper. and they stimulated the demand for a lot of other products and created a lot of other new industries. I should also note that while railroads were growing and successful in this period, they ended the canal age. Most canal companies went bankrupt. In any event, a look at the total number of railroad miles shows how fast railroads grew. In 1830, there were only 23 miles of railroads. In 1840, there were approximately 2,800 miles. In 1850, there were just over 9,000 miles. But by 1860, there were 30,000 miles. And most of these were in the north, which is not too surprising. And it's going to be obviously influential in stimulating the Industrial Revolution up north and the growth of cities up north, and it's going to play a role in the Civil War as well. Speaking of communication and transportation, throughout the 1830s, inventors in Europe were working on electromagnetic communication, and in 1837, the first electric telegraph was patented. Soon, however, Samuel Morse, a well-regarded painter who had studied in Paris, invented the first single-wire telegraph and a code to interpret the signals, a series of dots and dashes that, of course, became known as the Morse code. The importance of this, of course, can't be overestimated. It's right up there with the spread of railroads. This meant instant communication. As fast as electricity could go, you begin to see wires build up. Now, this was going on really in the 1840s and in the 1850s, but you do see the beginnings of it, very end of the 1830s. Here you can see a copy of that Morse code, the dots and the dashes. By 1850, most cities had telegraphs, and by 1861, a telegraph extended all the way to San Francisco. I should note that telegraphs and railroads often extended together. Tracks were single and became, and because trains frequently broke down, it was difficult for the trains to keep a schedule. Without a schedule, trains could end up facing each other in the middle of nowhere on the same track. Now, with telegraphs, however, word could be sent that a schedule needed change or if there was a breakdown. And this meant that train travel was even faster and cheaper and more popular than ever. In 1836, one of the more significant inventions was Samuel Coates' revolver. That was patented in 1836, and it really changed the dynamic of riding horsebacks and fighting the Indians in the West. And it meant you could fire more than one shot, and it's easier to aim with a pistol. So this was really significant. The first guns had been way back muskets, which had a round ball, and they were slow to load. And when they'd shoot, the ball would sort of rattle around this big barrel, and it wasn't that accurate. Well, earlier, you have rifles being developed where there were ridges in the barrel, and it sent a bullet out. Well, in 1837, the first breech-loading rifles were invented, and you could load them from the back and not down the barrel. And in the 1840s, this was even improved upon dramatically with smaller bullets known as the mini ball, named for the French guy Mini that invented them. And obviously, this is going to have a huge impact in the Civil War years later. You're going to see some pretty big advances in agriculture. Now, a bit earlier, there had been a guy named Jethro Wood who invented the first cast iron plow that had interchangeable parts. And so it was more sturdy than a wood plow. And if it broke down, you could just change the part and not have to replace the whole plow. Now, this was good 15 or 20 years earlier, but when time you get into about 1830s and 1840s, it's going to dramatically improve from there as well. In 1837, a guy named John Deere improved the plow with the first commercially successful steel tip plow. And this is really important because steel was stronger than the iron, and a lot of people earlier had even been afraid to plow with iron, afraid it'd corrupt the soil. but steel's a stronger metal than iron. It didn't break as much on rough terrain where there are rocks, and so his sod buster I'll talk about later on. But it's a dramatic improvement in the plow. By 1836, a number of other inventions were being developed and would soon transform America. Several inventors were actually working on designs to improve harvesting, which had essentially remained the same for centuries, a sickle and whatnot. By the 1830s, the earliest models could cut 6 acres of grain a day. And later on, the improvement's going to be even much faster and more productive. The big advance in this came a little bit later with the inventor Cyrus McCormick, and he would sort of emerge from this competition among entrepreneurs in the 1840s with his mechanical reaper. You can see how McCormick's reaper worked here. A horse would pull the reaper, and it had a rotating blade that would cut the grain. Before people would just have to use those sickles and whatnot, but now they could just follow along with the rake and rake up what had been cut. In later years, of course, this would be improved upon, and the people would ride on platforms, and it would cut the grain on top of the platform, and that is going to get ultimately into the combines we have today. But in the early 1830s, the London Times called McCormick's reaper, quote, a cross between a flying machine, a wheelbarrow, and a chariot, unquote. In the late 1830s, inventors were working on improving things like clocks and locks. By the 1840s, the number of handheld clocks exploded with the growth of interchangeable parts and mass production techniques. Pin tumbler locks became popular later on in the 1850s, but all of these were being experimented on in the 1830s, just about ready to transform America. Going back to steam for a second, as railroads grew, so did the use of steam-powered rotary presses. And this was really important because it dramatically increased the number of newspapers. You didn't have to crank them manually, and it could rapidly increase literacy and publications. Improvements in transportation and communication led to many new industries, and one of the more interesting ones was the exporting of ice from the north to hotter climates in the south. This trade actually started a bit earlier than the 1830s, when ice was transported in what amounted to coolers to rich homes in northern cities. Many of these homes had what they call ice cellars. Ice obviously helped preserve food and drink, but it made drinks cooler and better. But you start seeing by the period we're looking at in the 1830s, and there were people trying to get a business started all the way down to get ice all the way down to the Caribbean. And there's one guy that dug ice cellars in key port towns on the way down and tried to devise shipping methods best to just preserve the ice. And one of the things that they'd found upon was sawdust to keep insulating the ice during ice transport. There was an ample supply of sawdust around the timber industry up north. Anyway, as the Antebellum age passed, you begin to see better and quicker clipper ships, and eventually, of course, steamships, which dramatically helped the ice exporting business. There were soon a number of people in the ice exporting business, and U.S. became one of the largest ice exporters in the world. Of course, all this went the way of went away when you have electrification, refrigeration, but that's after the Civil War. The first photography as we know it today was by a Frenchman in the 1830s, but by the 1840s, photography really became much more common and popular with the invention of daguerreotype photography, named for the guy that founded it. And it took a while to expose your photographs, so you have to wait a long time. And when they would take photographs of people, they'd have them sit there, and they would have something often holding their head so they couldn't move. If you moved, then the photograph would get blurred, so it took a while. But later on in the 1850s, they cut back the long exposure necessary by having what we'll call wet plates or emulsion plates. This was this type of photography that was common in the Civil War, you might have seen. But in any event, this is our the end of the first video on just some of the inventions that were transforming America in this period.